Hey, Georgia Sean and Swedish Joe here. We are having a brew day today. One of the things you probably see in our YouTube videos is us drinking beer, but we also brew beer. And so today we're sitting down and bringing beer, and we've decided to make a video for you to show you, if you're not familiar with the process of brewing beer, how fun and easy, and it's a nice project you can do as a group or even individually. So,
but it's much more fun if you more than one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, right? So, starting off, what we're doing is today we're making a Swedish style IPA. The grain bill we have is 12 pounds of 2-row, pound of Munich, right? And then we've used some Swedish hops that we got through some illicit
Contraband.
means. Contraband. Through my mother-in-law. She has a little hop plant in her backyard, a little vine going on. So we're doing that. We're going to end up splitting at the end and doing some elderberry in one, and then using a base beer to see the difference in that flavor.
Yeah.
And that's one of the nice things about brewing your own beer, is you can experiment like that. You can say, I'm going to make a beer I know, but I'm going to take a few gallons of that and I'm going to try something different. So starting off with the things you're going to need to do your own brewing, you're going to need a kettle, you're going to need a burner, you're going to need a mash tun and a hot liquor tank. Now, a mash tun really is where you're going to put the grains in to soak them so they have a chance to convert from starch into sugars. The hot liquor tank is a little bit of a misnomer. There's no liquor in it whatsoever. It's really should be called hot water tank. But again, you can use things like Igloo coolers, Home Depot coolers, that kind of stuff. You just get yourself some ball valves, usually online at a home brew shop, some tubing, and that'll serve you just well. You're also going to need a thermometer. You're going to need some kind of strainer to help get some of the hops and whatnot out of your wort when you're pouring it in and getting ready to into your vessel, like whether it be a plastic bucket or glass carboy. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we get closer to moving it into that stage of the brew day. You're also going to need a copper or stainless steel cooling device. We use the spiral copper version. It will help, like a heat exchanger, takes the warmth out of it at the end of the brew. It helps it get down to a more manageable temperature where yeast can survive. And then, of course, one of the most important things you need is beer. You also want to make sure you have a notepad or your iPhone or something where you can keep track of actually what you're doing. Then you can replicate it. You can know what worked, what didn't work. And so for this, I'm going to keep track of my brew, and you want to keep track of start times, stop times for mash, when you start sparging, when the boil happens, when you put the hops in, all these kind of things. You just want to document it somewhere. So in case you want to do it again, you can do it again. You're just making a recipe, just like everywhere else. One of the things you do after you warm up your water, you want to get it to about 170 degrees so that you can mash in. Mashing in is basically taking grain, soaking it with warm water, and allowing it to convert naturally starch into sugar, which is thus what you can then wash through a process called sparging, which we'll show you later, and that is what you'll use to brew your beer. So we'll start with some grain. I'll initially put in a little bit of this grain, then Swedish Joe here is going to add some water on top of it, and you want to do this in segments so you don't end up with any dry spots. You're trying to make kind of a little bit of a porridge. And so we'll put in a little bit of grain, some water. We're trying to keep the water just above the grain line. And so we're gonna finish pouring this in. Joe, if you'll give us 2 more real quick.
I will.
So you can see we've got it plenty above where we need it to be, above the grain. We're going to go ahead and seal this up. And again, this is why you can use those Igloo coolers or the Home Depot coolers. Leave this sealed up, and during this time, for about 60 to 90 minutes, you want to let it sit and mash in. And at that point, we will go ahead and sparge. So we'll be back then. So right now we're warming up some more water for the sparge. The sparge is the process where you essentially run water across the grains that you've been mashing and wash the sugar that has been created from converting the starch into sugar into your kettle. So you need to have it about 170 degrees, give or take, because you don't want it too warm. The warmer the water is, the more likely you're going to leach tannins out of the grain itself, and that won't taste good. If you don't have it warm enough, though, you won't be able to continue washing those off, because again, the cooler the water, the less it's going to work in your favor washing the grains. Plus, the warmer the water that you get into the kettle, the less time you spend warming up the brew as you start to brew. So right now we're going to check this water, see if it's about right, and then we'll move it into our hot liquor tank over there. Alright, so now that the mash has been sitting there for over 60 minutes, we've probably got some good starch conversion. There's a couple ways, if you read on the internet, you can do an iodine test like that, but generally if you do a 60-minute mash, you're probably pretty safe. Theoretically, you could do a little less, but you might get less starch conversion. And again, more sugar means a little bit more alcohol, which probably is a better brew in general. So in here in the mash, if you want to take a look, we'll show you what it looks like now. So you can see we have this very kind of oatmeal consistency in there. Everything's swollen. And we're going to start doing the Vorloff. Mr. Swedish Joe, will you come and help us do the Vorloff? The Vorloff is a process where we come and we try to create a tighter filter bed.
Yeah.
And so the tighter filter bed means that we're going to pull some of it off, get some of those little grain pieces that are in there. We want to get them out. So if you'll pour a little bit, you don't want to do it too fast, just a little. Because again, we're trying to get some of the crap out of it essentially. So why don't you pull this over here? You can see it's got stuff in it. So what we're going to do is we're going to pour it back in, and this Vorloffing process, what it does is it keeps putting it and building that filter bed tighter and tighter until we have a much clearer wort to work with. And that will make sure that we don't have so much tannins in our beer, so you won't get that harsh taste. Again, you don't want to open it wide up, because then what happens is you might slam your grain bed together, and if you got your grain bed totally slammed together, then you're going to have trouble sparging. Vorloff, probably you're going to do about 5 to 10, little potfuls of, depending on how much you're filling up your pot. Again, the goal is to have a relatively clear wort to work with, and you can see it's already getting clear.
Getting better.
It will be even better soon. All right, and so
this is the result you're looking for.
Something, again, not a lot of those grain shells, not a lot of pieces. It's not going to be perfectly clear, of course, but the goal is to have just little specks as opposed to pieces in there.
Yeah.
So before that, and now we're going to go ahead and move on to the sparge process. So now we're going to move to the sparge process. The sparge, again, is where we are trying to wash the grains, sugar off the grains, into the brew kettle itself. And so we're starting with that hot liquor tank where we filled up the water up here into it. We're going to let it run through into this grain mash here. One of the things you want to do is you want to make sure you're not drilling a hole with water. If you have the water coming out of a tube pointing straight down, it's going to drill a hole in there, and you're not going to get the full amount of grain. Because remember, there's all this grain there with all this lovely sugar that's going to turn into lovely beer. So you want something to go ahead and spread that water across. Some dispersion device. You can use a bowl, where it comes off the sides. You can use some sort of metal kind of netting, something again that's creating it. But I found that this particular device, it's just a pot from a steaming, kettle. You just kind of throw it in there on the top, and then as you see, as we turn on this water, we're going to start getting some water dispersion here. So what you're trying to do is get a nice little kind of stream, a small stream of the brew coming out. You want a sparge to last around 15 minutes, give or take. Some people say, oh, you got to do 30 minutes. Yeah, theoretically you could, but you're really trying to get about 15 minutes. 10 minutes is way too short. 20 minutes, I think, is you're just spending time watching water drip. So as we're doing it, you see we're starting to build up this water just a little. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and open this, but we're not going to open the valve too much. Again, we're just trying to get it to come over a 15-minute process.
Yeah, that's good.
And so you got to stand here and you got to watch this so you can make sure that you don't get too much water in here. or too little. Because again, if the water's not above the grain, you're not going to be washing all the grains off. So watch it happen. You're trying to get your 5 gallons in there. Usually go for 5.5, maybe 6 at most, because of course this is what you're brewing. This is your work. All right, so now we have sparged fully. As you can see, we have a good 5.5 to 6 gallons of wort to start brewing with. FYI, with their mash, now we've got all this leftover grain. People go, well, what are we gonna do with this grain? There's a few things you can do with it. You can dump it out for the birds, right, which is what we do. You want to spread it out thick though so it doesn't mold, you know, like you just spread it across, thin. You want to, so that the birds can get to it as it dries. You can also make dog biscuits out of it. Now, a really important factor, we will talk about this a couple times, hops are lethal to dogs. Do not make a hop mixture and give it to your dog, right? But grain by itself is perfectly fine. There's a lot of recipes out there you can make dog biscuits if you got a dog. But as I said, we kind of lay it out for the birds. You know, it's a nice thing. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take this wort here and we're gonna go up and we're gonna start boiling it, because this again is our brew itself. So now we've of course started the boil and the boil bubble has popped. As you can see, our brew is in full effect. This is the point where you'll start counting your 60 minutes. Usually you want to do about a 60-minute boil. This is also where we're going to add our hops. So of course we're using these Swedish hops out of the garden. There are of course hop that's already been turned into pellets. Those are actually really great. I actually do like hop pellets, because hop pellets actually, you know, really concentrate that hop into a smaller quantity like of things. So when you do 1 ounce, it's actually a more intense flavor than 1 ounce of hop flowers, right? Yeah. So, but we're going to take these because again, we're doing this Swedish style IPA with real Swedish hops right out of my mother-in-law's garden. So thank you, Eva, for this, right? And so we're going to go ahead and pour this in at this point. You can see it's going to start, and what will happen, be careful by the way, when you're working with hops in the boil, especially early in the boil, that lupulin gets in there and that hop oil gets in there and starts, and you'll sometimes get a boil over. So you got to watch it at this point. You got to hang out here and just watch it happen. Now remember, during the boil, this is the part where you want a rough boil. You want it to be rough and angry. You want that pot just all over the place, because it's throwing that hops around, whether it's a pellet or a flour. It's throwing it all over and knocking around, get that oil mixed in real good so that your beer actually has some flavor. Show that back. Yes, and so after, we're going to take and we're going to dry hop it. And the reason this is important, and we'll talk about this later, you can see we've got some more of a prior dried hop, and you can see all that lupulin. This is all that hop oil that you're going to want. That's going to get into that beer, which is going to add that hop flavor, that IPA traditional flavor that you're used to. Remember, do not let your dogs get anywhere near this. You see Furious Bjorn, he's running around, but we are watching like a hawk. You may not see in the video that we're doing that, but we are watching him constantly to make sure he doesn't get anywhere near those hops. Hops will kill your dog. Keep it away from them. Alright, so now that we're getting close to the end, about 20 minutes before the end of the boil, what you want to do is you want to consider if you're going to use something like Irish moss. When you brew a beer, the proteins are breaking apart. It's called the hot break. What's happening is proteins are breaking apart and they are loose in the boil itself. Something like Irish moss, which is really a seaweed that's been charged, will help grab those proteins and bring them down. I don't want to say proteins are the enemy of beer, but that's what creates a lot of the haze and stuff that you don't necessarily think is great in a beer, right? Again, it's not like a wheaty beer where the haze is intentional. Most beer you probably want to drag some out. So it doesn't add any flavor or anything to beer, but it helps remove elements. So you take a good teaspoon of it, you put it in the beer, and you let it boil with it, and it will help drag down that protein structure. So as we're getting close to the end of the boil, about 15 minutes before, you want to stick in your copper or stainless coil that's going to help you chill this beer later. The reason you want to do it about 15 minutes early is you want the boil to sterilize this copper coil, because again, you're going to be using it after the boil. Cleanliness is really important as you get at the end of the boil, because there's nothing left to kill that bacteria. So the difference between sanitizing is what you do in the carboys and with all the equipment you use to move beer around is a chemical process. Sterilization is a heat-based process, and that's what we're doing with the coil and the boil. So we're just going to go ahead and set it in there
And just be careful with the hoses.
Yes,
So
be careful with the hoses. We've learned that before.
yep.
And you just leave it there, and you're just going to let it go ahead and sterilize in this heat. I will turn it up just a little bit more so we can make sure, because that cold copper just cooled it down real quick. But again, 15 minutes of boil, we'll sterilize that good, and then we'll go ahead and use it at the end of the boil to chill the brew. All right, so now we are done with our boil, and we have to chill. So the Wort chiller, again, that spiral copper, is going to help us drop this temperature down. We're trying to get it under 100 degrees, because if it's at 100 degrees, it's going to destroy the yeast. It's going to kill it. So we need to chill this down so we are able to move it into the carboy and then aerate it and then add the yeast. So what we're doing right now is running some cold water just from a hose through this Wort chiller, goes through the heat exchanger, comes out here. One of the things I like to do with this lukewarm water is take advantage of it. It's an opportunity in the next 10-15 minutes as we're sitting there waiting for it to chill down to clean some of my equipment that I've used. Because again, then I'm not fully wasting it, and it gives me something to do during this 10-15 minutes. So after this, we'll move it to the carboy. So now we're going to go ahead and siphon off our wort into our carboy. We'll use a 1/2-inch tube with the pump so that we can create it, you know, again, that siphon action. I'll go over there, over to Swedish Joe, who is managing the other end of the tube, and you'll see that we're going to use a double filter process, one with a strainer and one with, of course, the filter.
The filter
itself
inside, yeah.
And that will allow us to limit the amount of hop residue and proteins that come in. So we're going to create a quick siphon. Right now we're doing okay. You want to keep a sanitized spoon or something around to move that across the finer strainer filter off of the funnel itself. But as you see, we're going to go ahead. Now again, this is not the opportunity we want to max and create the most amount of beer in here. We want to try and get ourselves a good 5 1/4 gallon, because we need room for fermentation in the carboy. You can also do this, of course, in a bucket, same principle. I'm a fan of glass because glass is easier to clean, glass you can see through. If you get scratches in glass, it's able to sanitize a lot easier than if you have scratches in plastic. So, just gonna hang out here and finish moving this beer, and then we'll move to the next step. All right, so now we're gonna aerate the wort. One of the things that is you wanna get a lot of oxygen right now. This is an important time. Obviously, when you have an open beer, you don't wanna have that kind of oxygen in it, but right now oxygen is key. Getting oxygen in there, getting air in there will help the yeast survive. So you can use a stone with an oxygen tank, or you can use an aerating device like this. All right, so we've aerated it now, and now the next step is that we will go ahead and pitch the yeast and lock it all up and get ready for it to ferment. All right, so now what we're gonna do is pitch the yeast. But before we get to yeast pitching, we want a specific gravity. We wanna know where we're at to start. Specific gravity measures the amount of kind of sugars and solids that are in the wort. And then what happens is when you finish fermentation, you take another hydrometer measurement, and you'll see that specific gravity, and that will tell you exactly the difference, which will allow you to calculate your alcohol content. So the tool that I'm using for this, I'm using a thief, and this thief here grabs a little bit of the beer, and then the hydrometer, and our measurement right now is about, these are in two little, each one's a 2 increments, so I'd say it's about 1042. Place this beer back in there so it has a chance to finish up fermenting. And now we will add the yeast. We'll put the airlock in place. You want to make sure that this is a mechanical airlock. Remember, it's just you're keeping a little bit of sanitizer in there to help avoid stuff. but it's mechanical. So it goes up and down. The CO2 travels through this as the yeast breathes, pops up, gives you a mechanical process. And we are ready for it to ferment. So you want to keep this particular, kind of beer. Generally, it's an ale, so in the 65-degree range. This will allow the yeast to really work well and create a good beer, good alcohol content, not a lot of esters. Too hot, you'll get a lot more esters, a lot more flavors you weren't expecting. Too cold, and the yeast will go dormant. So you want to go ahead and have that kind of around the 65-degree mark. So, during winter, you might find yourself bringing this in the house. Not that you'll keep it outside, but if you have like us, like a beer house or a garage or something like that, during the summer you're probably fine, unless it's really hot, and you might have to bring it in the house as well. So keep that in mind. Shooting for the 65 range, give or take 5 degrees. Hey, Georgia Shauna and Swedish Joe back here again with our beer. As you can see, this beer is starting to click away, pumping CO2 out because of fermentation. The yeast activity is strong. It is going through, and you can see, look, just click, 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 click. Got a lot of CO2 coming out as the yeast activity is going on. This sweet wort is now being transformed into alcohol because of this yeast activity. See this nice layer of krausen that's starting to develop here. Krausen, of course, is a protective layer the yeast has created, on this beer. It's a foamy top, but it's actually very thick. And if you look in here, you can see the yeast is working a lot because you can just see the movement, all the particles in this wort as the yeast is moving it around, drinking in this sweetness and putting out all this alcohol. Just constant movement in it. And soon enough, this will be beer.
Yay!
And again, Swedish Joe and Georgia Sean here. Saying thanks for brewing with us, thanks for drinking with us, and give us a thumbs up if you like what we taught you. If you think we're idiots, add it in the comments. Be happy to hear it.